So it's my pleasure to welcome George Packer.
Thank you. And before we talk about Richard Holbrooke, I have to say, I hardly know him. I met him for 30 seconds. That is Walter Isaacson at Aspen.
Where was it?
Here, 10 years ago.
Okay.
I am not in a position to do him any favors. That review was on the level. Many reviews are not. That one was on the level.
Yeah, you actually had a couple that weren't on the level. That seemed to be people who had an axe to grind.
More about Holbrooke than...
More about Holbrooke. Yeah, I didn't mean an axe to grind. Nobody has an axe to grind with you. But no, most people think that reviews are some incestuous club where we all write New York Times reviews of our friends' books. And so many people have said, you know, you must be a good friend of his. I said, no, it's on the level. I actually think I met him once, so thank you. One of the things biographers face, and you did in the Holbrooke book so well, is a person who is great in parts and infuriating in parts. So let's start there about how, and we could, you know, throughout history, whether it's Thomas Jefferson or, you know, James Watson and DNA or, you know, anybody, Richard Nixon even, you have to be able to say it's not all one or the other.
I mean, first, we owe it to the readers to tell the truth. That's to me, the highest loyalty is to our readers. And if we know, if we've uncovered a story that's shameful or scandalous or just shows a kind of smallness of spirit or meanness, and there are many such stories about Holbrooke, you can't conceal them, because if you do, you're breaking the contract with the reader. On the other hand, there is a tendency among biographers to pile up the bad stuff as if you're a prosecutor in court creating a transcript of just one wrongdoing after another until by the end the reader is just saying guilty, guilty, guilty. And I don't see any reason to write such a book, because why do you want to spend time with such a person? And Holbrooke had such good and bad qualities in such abundance that the real task was just to figure out how to get my arms around them and create out of this massive and messy and disorderly life a narrative that would pull the reader straight through from start to finish without getting bogged down in whether he was on balance, good or bad, because I don't think that's really...
Well, to rewind the tape a bit so we can tell some people, you know, exactly who Richard Holbrooke was, I will say this about Richard Holbrooke. He's been here to Aspen many times, but he was such a larger-than-life character that at any meal and at any moment, people were going to get into an argument about Holbrooke. And finally, I think it was Fareed Zakaria made one of those international signs with the red slash with a Holbrooke, which meant at lunch you could talk about Holbrooke only once, but you couldn't circle back and talk about him a second time if he wasn't there.
Yeah, and it became a kind of recurring problem in my interviews. The first thing everyone wanted to tell me, who wasn't spinning me in a positive direction, was the worst thing he had done to them. Because they'd been sitting on it for years. They'd had to swallow it in his presence. He had left the room before they could think of an answer. And so it was just the first thing out of their mouths. And it was always sort of a little shock, because here's this decent, kind person sitting in front of me, and I don't like to think of being treated cruelly, but he had it in him to be cruel to people who were either disregarded mortals or threats, competitors, peers, rivals. That was the position you did not want to be in, someone at his level who might encroach on his...
And real quickly, for those who don't know who he was, because oddly enough, he was larger than life, but all he was a mid-level diplomat who solved one war in a distant place, but never made it to Secretary of State.
Right. I used that phrase, mid-level diplomat, in a Washington think tank, and I was roundly chastised by some State Department. He was upper mid-level. Okay. So let's
his
call
own
him,
mind, the more was upper realm that was more important.
More upper than mid. He was an upper mid-level diplomat whose reputation and notoriety were already fading before I finished the book, because history is brutal that way. It just runs right over people and moves on. And people who, while they're alive, seem like no one will ever forget them. A few years later, hardly anyone has heard of them other than his 5,000 closest friends.
So real quickly, He was a Foreign Service officer in Vietnam, which is a glorious part of your book. Then,
So he began his career in the Mekong Delta in '63, which was the epicenter of the war at that point. He was a Foreign Service officer detailed to AID. So he was handing out bulgur wheat and building materials and training the local self-defense militias against the Viet Cong. He was at the very front edge of counterinsurgency. So he was in a front row seat to see the war in its early stage. And what he saw right away, because he had this incredible intelligence and honesty, was that we were losing because two reasons. One, our technology, our strength was our weakness. We were using firepower indiscriminately and creating enemies out of peasants who were just trying to survive. And two, we were lying to ourselves. We were sending reports up the chain from the ground, from the field to Saigon to Washington, that were saying everything is fine.
and Democrats, as he was at that time, who came out of the Vietnam experience, all came out with the Vietnam syndrome that we shouldn't get into quagmires or start winning hearts and minds, except Richard Holbrooke.
He was not haunted by Vietnam, and his cohort, who play a big role in the book, Tony Lake and others, were haunted by Vietnam. I think maybe it's a good thing to be haunted by Vietnam because it's haunting. But on the other hand, Holbrooke did not see it as the end of American leadership and the end of our place as a standing for something larger than just great power interests. He came of age under the influence of this earlier generation who you have written about beautifully in The Wise Men, Acheson, Kennan, Harriman, Marshall, who created the post-war world and who filled this space that was waiting to be filled when the rest of the world lay in ruins. And Holbrooke wanted to be like them. He wanted to be another big American who walked out across the globe and took the lead and solved problems. And Vietnam was not going to get in the way of that.
And so he becomes one of the great, what we would call liberal interventionists. Is that a fair word, or do you get criticized when you use it?
Or internationalist, but
and you would put Hillary in that category, maybe Madeleine Albright.
Absolutely.
Some of the tough Democrats who, as opposed to the McGovernite side. Was that because he deeply believed that, or is that because he believed Democrats were susceptible to be considered too dovish and thus not allowed to be president?
Yes.
Okay.
Both. I mean, he was an idealist. He thought America had to lead or problems would never get solved. We'll get to Bosnia, which is the best example. On the other hand, he was a calculating politician who looked at the landscape in Washington after Vietnam and saw Democrats getting destroyed by charges of having stabbed the country in the back and lost the war. And rather than outdoving the doves, he tried to move to the center right and was for intervention in Afghanistan and Nicaragua. He was pretty much for the Reagan wars, and
also for the first and second Gulf War.
Yes, the first Gulf War he was for. He was out of office during all that period.
Yeah.
Because he only served under Democrats, but he served under every Democrat.
But
from Kennedy.
I think my wife remembers because we got into an argument when we were about to do the second Gulf War. We're saying, "What the hell are we thinking?" And Holbrooke said, "We have to be interventionist."
Well, what I learned during my research was Holbrooke went to see John Kerry. Actually, Kerry came to see him at his apartment in Manhattan. This was in the fall of 2002. And Holbrooke said, if you're going to run for president in 2004, you have to vote for the war resolution. Cold political calculus. And Holbrooke, too, spoke out in favor of it before the Senate because he wanted to be Kerry's Secretary of State, and he was stuck in that logic of a
Didn't he see that second war with Iraq was so similar to Vietnam, and it was a fool's errand?
No, he didn't. In fact, he testified to the Senate that it would be good to have the UN with us, but we don't need the UN. And he compared Saddam to Milosevic and said Saddam is infinitely worse. We didn't have the UN during the Kosovo War, so there's kind of a new order here. And no, he was for it.
Let's go back to biography and the personal biography stuff. and everybody starts with their Holbrooke story, like you can't believe what he did to me. And you decide not to pile on, but you have all of that in there. Did you leave things out, not simply for balance, but as a biographer, I've sometimes faced this, where you just say, okay, that one just doesn't, that one is more hurtful than it is helpful to the reader. I'm leaving that part out of this biography.
In just one detail, which I'm not going to repeat because
Yeah,
it would
obviously.
be the same crime against Holbrooke if I put it in the book. But really only one. I mean, the most significant
Was it,
thing-
I mean, I'm not going to play 20 questions, but was it a personal or a policy?
It was very personal.
Okay.
But the most significant personal thing I learned about him
Big break in the book.
was that he tried to run off with his best friend's wife, Tony Lake's wife.
He and Tony Lake start in the pacification program in the same time in Vietnam.
And they're best friends.
They're best friends at each other's wedding. They play tennis. They even smoke pot
A lot of
together.
tennis.
Lots of tennis.
Not that much pot, but a lot of tennis.
And I think it came as a shock to everybody when you revealed in the book, and I didn't quite get it. I read it carefully. I don't know if they had an affair or he pursued an affair.
He pursued an affair, but the only living person who's in a position to tell me says that that was not an affair as we think of an affair. Okay. But there was love on both sides. They fell in love with each other, Mrs. Lake and Holbrooke. And Holbrooke's marriage was starting to get old in his mind. He was tired of it. He had two young sons who, I hate to say it, didn't particularly interest him at that point. He was restless. He was out of government. He didn't have that maniacal focus on some problem in the world. And so he was ripe for what some men do, except with your best friend's wife is kind of a beyond any line that most people would think you shouldn't cross. And it poisoned their relationship, Lake and Holbrooke, for the rest of their careers. And they
Which becomes a problem because Lake becomes National Security Advisor under Clinton. And then is an advisor to the Obama campaign.
So Lake was always a step ahead of Holbrooke because he was more a true, to the manner born diplomat. He was a WASP from New England. He was smoother. He didn't have the raw edges. And so Lake was always in a position to keep Holbrooke out if he wanted. And when Clinton was elected, after 12 years in the wilderness, Holbrooke finally had a shot at a big job, and he didn't get one because both Lake and Warren Christopher couldn't stand him. So this is partly a story of how your character affects
You just
policy
said something
and
really
politics.
interesting, which is a key to the book. You talked about the wise men, and they're to the manner born. They were the WASP establishment.
Yeah.
Anthony Lake is born into that.
Although not comfortable
Not
being in it.
comfortably, but he was born into it, and like even a Bill Bundy or something becomes uncomfortable. But they are from that. They don't have to worry about that background. Holbrooke, even to his friends, up until his birthday party, famous one, he kept quiet the fact that he was from Jewish immigrant parents.
Yes.
And his name had been changed.
Yes.
And I think that you see that he cannot cloak his ambition with the sort of velvet quality that a Tony Lake knew how to do.
He felt like an outsider. He once said to a friend in the presence of his then girlfriend, Diane Sawyer, she gets everything she wants, but I have to fight for everything because for some reason people don't like me. Mm-hmm. And that for some reason gives you a little hint at the massive blind spot that kept him from seeing himself.
He was the least self-aware person we've ever met.
He could not laugh at himself, and to me, being able to laugh at yourself is a sign of self-awareness. So it was kind of a fatal flaw in the end.
Definitely. But one of the complexities, we've been talking about, you have to take the strength because he barrels ahead with an amazing force of diplomacy in many cases. You say he's great for this reason, and in your book, he ends up being a great man.
Almost.
Great. But then you say all the flaws. Here's the complex thing that you do, and I want you to explain, which is you say it's not as if it's two separate things.
Right.
The flaws and the strength. And you even use a toilet metaphor at one point near the end about the junk they leave behind is also part of who they are. But the question is,
I regret it.
I mean, the question is, sometimes whether it's the provocativeness of a James Watson, or the weird paranoia of a Richard Nixon, or the strange, unreflective ambition of a Holbrooke, that's not something that you can gene edit out and the other genes remain the same. They're interwoven as one personality.
Don't you think it's true of all of us? I mean, if you took away the part of Holbrooke that, for example, demanded to get onto the shuttle to Auschwitz for the 50th anniversary of the camp's liberation so he could sit next to Elie Wiesel, and bumped a couple who were survivors of the camp so that they had to find their own way back into Auschwitz, which to me is maybe the single most horrifying thing I ever heard about him. If you tried to cut that part out of him so that he didn't bump survivor couples off the bus to Auschwitz, you would probably cut out the thing that made him go toe-to-toe with Milosevic over hours and hours of heaps of lamb and rice in the presidential palace in Belgrade, and finally master him. Because there was it took a kind of shamelessness, a kind of willingness to do anything, to go anywhere in order to end the war in Bosnia. I once spoke to a woman who was at the U.S. Embassy in Sarajevo during the war. And at one point, Holbrooke came storming in because of this tragic accident that had just happened, throwing his helmet, screaming, swearing, and the Bosnian staff were saying, "Who is this? This isn't a diplomat. He looks like a hooligan." And then she said to me, "But we've seen many diplomats come to Sarajevo, and none of them has done a thing. And maybe it will take someone like this, who reminds us of the warlords who are fighting the war, to end it." You can't disentangle those things. The idealism and the egotism needed each other. One without the other would have been impotent, I think.
But I've written about people who had flaws like that. So many people ask, did he really have to do all those things? I mean, don't we have to judge him pretty harshly?
I do.
Even though that was part and parcel of his greatness. Say, you didn't have to do that.
I do.
You didn't have to go to Tony Lake's wife and bump the Auschwitz survivors.
Exactly. I do. All I'm saying, to analyze him as a human being, I think if you start trying to disentangle, extricate the good from the bad, you will end up with a kind of empty shell, because they work together. And at times, the balance shifts. And when his egotism is threatened or is exacerbated or stimulated, that's when he behaves badly. When his idealism has latched on to something truly worthy, like ending the war in Bosnia, that's when you forgive his egotism, because you see it getting things done.
Well, sometimes it's both the egotism and ambition aren't in of themselves good or bad. It's what purpose were they for?
Yeah, he once said that in his diary. And Tony Lake, who was always far more restrained than Holbrooke, once said of Holbrooke, he wants attention, but he wants it for what he does, not for what he is. And that's his saving grace, which is a pretty generous thing to say.
What was Tony Lake thinking in that last scene in your book, near the last? He's sitting in the balcony at the memorial service alone, up in the balcony.
Yes, at the UN General Assembly. Yeah, so Lake was working at UNICEF then, his last job under Obama when Holbrooke died, and he just sneaked into the auditorium, which is it's a Tony Lake thing to do. Don't mind me, I'm not here to cause a stir, because if people notice, they might say, "Hey, Tony Lake came to..." He wanted to pay respect, not to Holbrooke personally, but to the past that they'd shared, to history, because he revered history and the past mattered. He didn't want to just write it off, even though he truly couldn't stand Holbrooke. The first time I called Tony Lake, I said, "I want to talk to you about Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Richard Holbrooke." And without missing a beat, he said, "Well, two of those subjects will be pleasant to talk about."
Anybody who thinks Vietnam is a pleasant subject
Yes.
to talk about has wow. And why did Obama become allergic to him?
Yeah, Obama really couldn't stand Holbrooke, could hardly stand to be in the same room with him at times.
Even on the same satellite feed, I think it was, yeah.
I think because Holbrooke was everything that Obama isn't. Holbrooke was dramatic. Obama was famously undramatic. Holbrooke lectured, flattered, condescended. Obama wanted a crisp briefing, no fuss. And this is where the blind spot toward himself really killed Holbrooke, because he couldn't understand why he couldn't win over this president. In fact, he lost Obama. You could say he lost him the first time they met. It was in Chicago right after the election. Obama had to call Holbrooke to Chicago because Holbrooke was too big just to ignore, even though Holbrooke had been for Hillary Clinton. Within a minute, Holbrooke committed 3 faux pas in regard to Obama. The first thing he did was gave Obama a signed copy of Holbrooke's own book on Bosnia, which is a kind of normal, slightly slimy Washington thing to do, I suppose, but he should have known Obama's not going to want that. The first time I interviewed Obama, the first thing he said to me was, "I haven't read your book," which is not what politicians usually do, but he wanted to.
Holbrooke was the opposite.
Just
Even
the
if he
opposite.
hadn't read your book, he would be
I
able to
loved
fake
your
it all
book.
the
I
way
loved
through.
it.
Yeah.
Second thing he did was to say, "Mr. President, could you please call me Richard, not Dick? My wife prefers people to call me Richard." So he corrected him in a way that maybe seemed a little bit weak. And the third thing he did was got teary-eyed and said, "You don't have to be African-American to cry." And I think at that point, there was no future between Barack Obama and Richard Holbrooke. This little gush of sort of display of emotion that for Obama must have been just distasteful. And for 2 years, Holbrooke worked as the envoy to Afghanistan and Pakistan and had very little influence on the president. I think it's a shame. I think Obama should have overcome the distaste because
You said it was a blind spot of Holbrooke's,
yes.
how to deal with the president. I came away with your book thinking Obama had a blind spot.
I think you can imagine the situation. Here's this new president, very young, very inexperienced, inheriting 2 wars and the worst economy since the Great Depression. And here's this big, sort of slightly out of control, rumpled and too talky older man who seemed to be the wrong kind of Democrat, the kind that had gotten us into Iraq. And Obama just didn't want to deal with it and didn't have maybe the maturity or wisdom at that stage of his presidency to realize, I need to let this guy be in the room because he can help me in Afghanistan. What Holbrooke could have done was to tell Obama, we need to talk to the enemy. It's the only way we could end the war in Vietnam, and it's the only way we'll end this war. And that was what Holbrooke wanted to do.
He could have done to the Taliban what he did to the warlords?
No, it would not have happened that way because Afghanistan isn't the Balkans. Afghanistan, in Holbrooke's mind, was Vietnam. He was reliving the war of his youth. And in that sense, he was haunted because Afghanistan was so similar in so many ways. But at least he had strategies and ideas for how to open a channel of diplomacy to the Taliban. And for a year and a half, he never had the chance to even bring it up to Hillary Clinton, let alone Barack Obama.
Why I would say, I mentioned to you that maybe Obama had a blind spot, is that when one studies leadership, it's easy to want around you no drama types, as Obama did. The hardest thing in being a leader, as Doris Kearns Goodwin does in Team of Rivals shows, is to be able to harness a Holbrooke. Hillary could do it, Obama couldn't. How did Hillary end up bringing in and knowing she should try to harness a Holbrooke?
You know, some people told me who knew Holbrooke and Obama that Obama did not like big competitive personalities around him. He didn't really want David Petraeus too close to him. He didn't want Richard Holbrooke too close to him. He surrounded himself with younger, very smart, very loyal aides. Holbrooke was not the kind of person he wanted to as a close advisor, whereas Hillary Clinton married a rogue. And clearly part of her character was drawn to that kind of
if you can marry Clinton, you can harness a Holbrooke, is what you're saying, yeah.
That's an image I'm going to try to get out of my mind. But basically, yes, that's what I'm saying. And she and Holbrooke, I'd say, really cared for each other. They were very loyal. And she saved his job at one point when everyone told Obama you should fire him, and Obama was about to do it. Only Hillary could stop him, and she did. Holbrooke tested her loyalty to the utmost. And on the last morning of his life, he went to the White House to meet David Axelrod, who he'd been trying to get a meeting with for weeks, to ask for a meeting with Obama. And Axelrod politely said, "You're not going to get a meeting with the president." From there, Holbrooke rushed to the State Department for a meeting with Hillary Clinton to talk about this channel to the Taliban. And in the middle of the conversation, she said, "Oh my God, Richard, what's happening?" His face had turned an unnaturally bright red. He stood up. He said, "I don't know. Something terrible is happening." His aorta had just torn open. And he was rushed to the hospital. And in those last minutes of his life, he was entirely himself. He was almost holding a staff meeting in the ambulance. He was flirting with the cardiologist in the trauma bay. He was telling his aide all the people he wanted to be sure heard that he loved them. The
doctor says, relax.
The doctor says, relax, think about the beach. He says, I hate the beach. She says, just relax. He says, I can't relax. I'm in charge of Afghanistan and Pakistan. And she says, let me worry about Afghanistan and Pakistan. Think of something you like. What do you like? And he opens his eyes and looks at this young cardiologist and says, I like beautiful women. Yeah. He was minutes away from the end of his life.
But he also asked an aide, I think, to take notes, knowing that he wanted this.
Are you recording my every witticism, he said. In massive pain, his chest just bursting open, and his aide is writing down everything he's saying on a credit card receipt from a Chinese restaurant, and Holbrooke wants to make sure he's getting it all down.
To give Hillary her due, too, if I remember, I'm not even sure this is in your book, but I remember that week, she just stayed at the George Washington Hospital the whole time, even though she was Secretary of State.
And when he died, she came downstairs and told his staff, who adored him. I mean, Holbrooke, as tough as he could be, was absolutely a cult figure to his young staff when he worked under Obama. And they still have reunions to remember him. How many bureaucrats can you say that about? And Hillary came downstairs to the lobby of the hospital to tell them he had died, and they wept in her arms. And they all went out and had drinks and told sad stories and happy stories about this great man.
One of the criticisms of your book, and to some extent I got it on the review I wrote, in which I say it was all part and parcel of the same thing, is how in the age of the Me Too movement you could, or I could in the review, be excusing flirting with women or sleeping with your best, or trying to sleep with your best friend's wife, and that somehow you were excusing this abusive and to some extent, although he never was abused. I mean, I never saw a case of abuse towards women. I mean, Diane Sawyer, you know, it wasn't like that was a unequal relationship. But that sense that you're kind of excusing the guy's flaws.
I just can't see it. I mean, it's not my job to thunder condemnation. I don't think that's what a writer does. A writer reveals. And there's plenty of grist for anyone who wants to say that Holbrooke objectified women or mistreated women. He also, it's not as simple as that. We oversimplify everything these days. Nothing can have its full, complicated human truth. Holbrooke also looked to the women who became his wives with a kind of, at least in the second and third case, and in Diane Sawyer's case, who he never married, with a kind of geeky worshipfulness, a fear that they might dump him at any moment, a desire to be worthy of them, a disbelief that I can't believe this beautiful woman is interested in me, this geeky Richard Holbrooke, who was a bit of a geek. So there was more than just an entitled man reaching for whatever.
One of the most complex relationships in the book, of course, is with his last wife, Cotty Martin, a very distinguished, great writer on her own, a person of great career, but they become, as you put it, climbing partners in some ways. And then she comes to you and says, warts and all, here's all the diaries.
Yeah.
What was her relationship with him really all about, and what was her relationship with you all about?
Well, they were a real love match, but they were also a personality match. I mean, they were rather like each other in some ways. They were both ambitious. They both liked the limelight and attention. They were going to be a great couple. That was part of the sense of what it meant when they found each other. and it was the third marriage for each of them. They said, let's get it right this time. Over the years, you know, it's hard for two big, ambitious personalities to coexist in the same marriage. And Holbrooke got older, and maybe, you know, he had all kinds of annoying habits and was difficult to live with. And his career was kind of going like this, and her career was going like this. And how do you maintain the balance? It was complicated, and it was not all happy.
And you wrote a totally, warts and all, but still sympathetic, in my mind, biography. How did you navigate Connie Martin, who was giving you all the access?
I made a condition that there'd be no strings. I asked her for his personal papers, which she gave me, and I asked for them with no conditions, which she gave me, and that was a great gift. And
I will give her credit
grateful to her.
because your book is not, as we say, purely favorable. And yet I noticed that she emailed around to friends, I'm on one of her email lists, both good reviews of the book, and she didn't attack anything public. I'm sure she was burned and hurt by some parts of it.
She had to have been.
It was a totally graceful
but it was a
move on her.
very generous, restrained, and graceful thing. And I think it was because she's a writer and understood that even though what I wrote was not her Holbrooke, it was my book, and she let it be, which was really a generous thing. I want to say one thing about the way I approached the writing of the book, though. I didn't think I could write this as a straight biography, because Holbrooke wasn't at the top, and it wasn't demanding a biography, and by the time it came out, he would be partly forgotten. What I felt was, in order to bring the reader through this huge life, I had to turn him into a kind of character, almost like in a novel. So I have a narrator telling the story the way the narrator of a novel tells the story, although, to be clear, this is all based in fact. It was as truthful as I could make it. But there's a kind of invented voice in the narrator who begins the book, Holbrooke, yes, I knew him. And that kind of sets...
Can't get his voice
out of my head.
Great lead.
And that sets you off in a kind of conversational, more intimate relation to the narrator, as if you're hearing a yarn, rather than being presented with the heavy monument of a life. Because I wanted Holbrooke to stay alive on the page, and I wanted the narrator to bring the reader into it in as intimate a way as possible.
That's what I meant earlier in the conversation when I said that I felt you had reinvented the craft of journalistic biography, because you do it where all of a sudden you're talking directly to us, like, you know, there's nothing to be learned from kindergarten or whatever.
Do you mind if we hurry through the early years?
Yeah, and I've not Halberstam a little bit, because to my mind your writing echoes Halberstam a bit, but he's not even somebody who would do that.
Well, he wrote in a form of new journalism, I guess, the best and the brightest, and I don't think of myself as a new journalist, even though I love a lot of that work, including that book, which is a masterpiece. I was thinking more about novels than journalism. I was thinking about Conrad with his narrator Marlowe telling the story of Lord Jim or of Kurtz in Heart of Darkness. I was thinking of maybe a little bit of Bellow or Roth, because Holbrooke is such a big,
But you also
messy
did
character.
Graham Greene, it seemed you were channeling.
A little, more, not so much in the voice, but in the theme, because Greene's Quiet American just hovered over every one of Holbrooke's cohort in Vietnam. They all read it, they all were dazzled by it, and they were all trying to say, that's not me. I'm not that guy who blunders into a war with high ideals and innocence and ends up getting a lot of people killed.
There's a wonderful line that you use in the book from Graham Greene. I'll let you say.
I never knew anyone who had better motives for all the trouble he caused. And that Greene really saw something. He really hated Americans, it's true, but his hatred allowed him a kind of penetration into the character of the Americans in Vietnam well before Holbrooke got there. And what he saw was, we are so taken with our own good motives that we don't really notice what we're actually doing.
I thought that line in The Quiet American of Graham Greene not only applied to the title character, it was almost an application to the country of the United States that Graham Greene was doing it. Do you think that is a theme of American foreign policy, is that our idealism allows us to blunder from Iraq to Iraq?
No doubt. I mean, you could call it idealism or less charitably naivete or even arrogance. It's maybe a mix, a kind of combustible mix of idealism and arrogance. Holbrooke had it too, where because we're Americans, we think, one, we're needed, and two, we're good. And so what's wrong with getting involved in other people's countries?
Explain to me what is incorrect about those two statements.
Sometimes we may be needed, but we can't do anything. I think by the time Holbrooke took on Afghanistan, as much as that war began as a necessary war, by 2009, it was an unwinnable war. We had allowed too much time to go by. We had become too distracted by Iraq. And the Taliban, like the Viet Cong, to some extent, although there are big differences, were preying upon a corrupt government that was our partner. Same thing as in Vietnam. We could not change that government, and we couldn't win with that government. Holbrooke saw all that. So in that sense, we couldn't do it. And are we always good? Of course not. No country is. Countries pursue their own interests, and we do it often with good intentions, but with poor information, because we're actually rather incurious about the rest of the world, with impatience, because we want to get it over with. We don't have the patience for the long commitments, and with a heavy hand sometimes. And all of those things are not always true, and anyone who says they are has to confront Bosnia, where we stayed out for 4 years.
And Rwanda.
And Rwanda, where we never got involved. And as a result, 2 genocides happened in the modern era. And Holbrooke, to his great credit, spent 3 years telling Bill Clinton, you've got to get involved in Bosnia in a way that is going to end the war, because the Europeans won't and can't. And in that case, the lessons of Vietnam were all the wrong lessons. So there's no single model here. And we shouldn't imagine that to be American means we must always do this or always do that. But we have that kind of thinking, which probably goes back to our Puritan origins and to the Declaration, which was a universal document.
Should we be involved in Syria still?
Well, we never were very involved in Syria. I mean, our involvement was always so small that it was no match for the Russians and the Iranians and for the government of Assad. I mean, I think the mistake Obama made was not necessarily to stay out, but to feint getting in and then to back out, which I think undermined his credibility with our allies and gave a green light to Putin that we were not going to be a problem for him, either in Syria or really in Ukraine, which followed very quickly after the Red Line incident in Syria. So I think that was, I don't have the answers for Syria. I don't know whether involvement could have made a difference in the war because it's such a complex and brutal business, but at least we shouldn't have said we're going in and then.
Yeah, but with all due respect, that's sort of the easy, I mean, we all can agree to that. It's a tougher.
I mean, anyone who says they have the answer for Syria, I just don't.
Afghanistan?
Certainly, I don't have the answer.
And Afghanistan, should we have been out of there a long time ago?
I don't think you can just pull the plug on a war and a people who you've made this commitment to, especially when there was an original reason which had to do with Al-Qaeda, which, although it's been pretty badly beaten up, the Taliban have never renounced it. Mm-hmm. And that was Holbrooke's recurring point. Yes, it's like Vietnam, but the Viet Cong were never a strategic threat to the United States, which is why that war was a great mistake. If the Taliban are capable of becoming a base for Al-Qaeda again, that's a strategic threat. Whether they would be, a lot of experts say no, they've changed, but we don't know, partly because we haven't been talking to them.
My last question before I open up gets back to the personal. One of the things in your book is that the driving force of Holbrooke was just ambition, unreflective, hardcore ambition, which is okay, but what was particularly interesting is a lot of people around him, from Barack Obama to Tony Lake, were also ambitious, but what they knew how to do and he couldn't do is cloak his ambition.
Yeah.
Put a bathrobe around it. I think you say it was so naked that we had to look at it. Was that the big problem?
Well, it made writing his story fun and interesting because so much is there right in front of your eyes and you can hardly take your eyes off
For
it.
example, he leads his own campaign to win the Nobel Prize, writing letters for others to sign.
He goes to Oslo 3 times after negotiating the end of the war in Bosnia just to have a cup of coffee with the secretary of the Nobel Committee. And Bill Clinton said to Al Gore, I think he might have got it if he hadn't tried so hard, which is kind of an epitaph on Holbrooke's life. So Lake and Holbrooke played a lot of tennis, and I see their relationship as sort of being symbolized by the competition on the court. Lake usually won, and the reason he won was because he didn't care so much about winning that he couldn't stand to lose. In order to win, you have to have a bit of detachment. If you know you'll be destroyed by losing, then you're going to lose. So Lake would hit high topspin shots to Holbrooke's backhand. He knew he kind of had his number, and he would get inside Holbrooke's head. And I think that's a little bit of what was going on the career ladder. Holbrooke never achieved his dream of becoming Secretary of State because he could not get out of his own way. He couldn't, in some ways, step back from losing. He cared too much, and he annoyed people around him to the point where 4 tries and he never got the job.
Yes, sir.
Your book is brilliant in so many ways.
Thank you.
Don't say comma, but. Just keep going.
I can feel it coming.
Take a Holbrooke approach. How did you decide that you were going to write this book? And it was so prescient in terms of even our policy in Afghanistan now. Is it used in any fashion as a teaching tool in foreign service circles or universities?
I mean, it just came out, so I don't think so. But if anything, it would probably be something like, don't be quite like this guy. You know, have all of his good qualities if you can, but don't do everything he did. I mean, I wrote the book. I'd written a profile of him while he was alive. After he died, Strobe Talbot and Les Gelb, 2 of his closest friends, approached me and said, would you want to write a book about him? I was working on another book at the time, which came out in 2013. So I didn't know if I wanted to, but I did know the papers were there and I had to get them or someone else would. I think possibly Evan Thomas, your friend, was interested. I'm not sure. So I had lunch with Kati and said, could I have the papers? And she gave them to me, and within a week they were in an Israeli moving van heading across the Brooklyn Bridge to my home office, where they sat for 7 years so that I couldn't even get the door all the way open because these massive black filing cabinets, that was Holbrooke. That was what was left of Holbrooke to me, the legacy, his papers. As soon as I started reading them, which after I finished the other book, I knew I had done the right thing because he was so alive and smart and was involved in so much and was such a good writer, such a pleasure to
the
read.
writing, which you quote a lot, it's breathtaking. And there's diaries, and there's letters to wives, ex-wives, future wives, whatever. That's all very, very revealing. I sometimes worry that we, if I may put myself in your category, journalistic biographers, are going to lose that now because people don't write diaries and letters anymore the way he did.
No doubt. At the end of his life, he recorded his diary on a microcassette recorder, so I heard his voice in those last months as you could feel his body actually breaking down in his voice, and it's quite moving and a bit chilling. Yeah, it's a wonderful thing to have that record which brings someone back to life. And so I quoted him at great length in 3 places, the 3 wars, Vietnam, Bosnia, Afghanistan, in order to let him tell the story in these first-person narratives, because he was such a good writer. And so once I read his own words, I realized that this was a book that I wanted.
He wanted to be a writer, as you say, and journalist, and he got turned down, I think, to be a New York Times stringer somewhere. Yeah. I often wondered whether if Abe Rosenthal had given him that assignment, the world would have been different.
Well, he told his college friends, I'm either going to be Secretary of State or editor of the New York Times.
Yes, sir, on the aisle, and then the woman, too, in front of you. Yeah.
Would you enlarge a bit on the second half of your title, The End of the American Century?
The end of the American century was the question.
Yeah. Holbrooke's life spans what I think of as the American century. He was born in 1941, which was the year Henry Luce coined the term, and the year the U.S. entered World War II and became a global power. He came of age assuming that we were the leaders of the free world. That was just his unreflected worldview. And at the end of his life in 2010, we were perceptibly declining as a supreme power, unrivaled. We now had rivals. China was rising. Russia was making an ugly comeback. Europe kept telling us that they didn't want us or need us. And Barack Obama, I think, sagely saw his job as being to manage that decline in as graceful a way as possible. So you could say that's the span. We are no longer able, and really beyond that, no longer willing to do what we did in the 40s and 50s and 60s, and even in that decade after the Cold War, the unipolar moment, because the public doesn't want it. And that's partly because the elites, including Holbrooke, really stopped explaining themselves to the public and didn't tell them why their sons and daughters had to go fight in these endless wars, and while they had no skin in the game themselves. And you could say that they lost the confidence of the public, and what we got was a turning inward that led to Donald Trump.
Here. Is it on? Oh, there it is on. One thing I think is interesting to note is that his son lives in Telluride.
Yes.
And maybe he's even here today. But his very last words to the Pakistani surgeon, could you comment?
Yeah, this is a misunderstanding. So the Washington Post, after Holbrooke's death, published an article saying his last words were, "You must end this war," to the Pakistani-American surgeon who tried to save Holbrooke's life. That's wrong on two counts. He said it to the Egyptian-American internist, who was also Hillary Clinton's family doctor, who was attending him before the operation, and he didn't say it. What he said was, she was the one saying to him, "Calm down, think of something you like." And he said, "I can't calm down, I'm in charge of Afghanistan and Pakistan." And she said, "Let me worry about that, I'll end the war." It was a kind of light attempt to get him to, and he said, "Fine, you end the war, you do it." And that somehow, once it was in the paper, which tells you to be careful about what you read sometimes, became this dramatic deathbed plea to end the war. Holbrooke didn't do dramatic deathbed pleas like that. He was doing the other things that made him Holbrooke, all the things that I told you about earlier.
Yes, sir, there, were you waving your hand? Yeah.
George, how did your views about Holbrooke change? Were they for the better or for the worse?
I mean, on days when I heard stories like the Auschwitz story, they changed for the worse. And at times I wondered, why the hell am I doing this? I don't particularly like this person. And then I would hear about some political prisoner he visited in Tibet when there were no cameras and no journalists around, and think he cared. He really cared. Most people in government may begin their careers out of an idealistic sense, but over time, a lot of them gradually accept the status quo because it's so hard to change it. And Holbrooke never accepted the status quo because out of that mix of idealism and egotism, he thought he could change it. And so on those days, I liked him better. And in the end, when you've been in the shoes and skin of someone for 5 or 6 years, at least you see the world as they saw it. And it's hard not to feel some kind of empathy and identification with them, even if he's unlike me in every way I can think of. I found myself almost wanting to justify him. Like, I know there's a lot of bad stuff here, but look, let's look at the sum total of it.
Which you definitely did. Last question?
One moment of kind of relative glory for him was when he served as the U.S. representative to the UN and really modeled kind of A, what the U.S. could do there, and B, what a statesman or a diplomat looked like. And it feels to me as though that's maybe separate from the American century. And to return to what the gentleman said earlier about how do we grow a diplomat like that again?
And if you don't mind, because it ties into the question you were just asked, and I want, maybe you can do a summation here. The question was at the UN, he did a variety of things, and it helped set up what an American diplomat could be. And at the end of your book, you talk about that, which is a time when America mattered, when somebody like a Holbrooke believed that what we did could count for something. And when the gentleman asked, why did you write the book, why did you come? Yeah. It almost seemed at the end you were saying, let's not forget that America can matter.
When Trump was elected that night, I kind of figured out what the book was about, because it was suddenly about an era that was over. I felt that now it's history. We're no longer in that time. We're headed for something else, something diminished from Holbrooke's time, because he embodied the outsized qualities that America is famous around the world for. He had the best and the worst of us. And the best of us was exhibited when he was at the UN, because it's very little known, but he saved our seat at the UN. We were about to get kicked out of the General Assembly because we owed $1 billion in back dues, which Jesse Helms and other Republicans were holding back. Holbrooke had to convince every country in the United Nations to raise their dues and let us lower ours, when we were by far the richest country in the world. And he had to convince the Republicans in Congress to release the money once the UN voted to do that. Imagine pulling off those two things. And he did it because he was relentless and tireless, and he cared. And so that is a moment when the institution that we pretty much invented in 1945 was about to lose whatever influence it still had, because the world's greatest power was about to become a deadbeat, and Holbrooke saved that for better and worse. I mean, the UN has not been covered in glory in the years since then, but better to have it than not, and Holbrooke knew that. And so that's one of the things that we should remember him for, and that we should also remember count, especially in other countries. We get so involved in our own wild swings between megalomania and depression, between thinking we can solve the world's problems and wanting nothing to do with the rest of the world. We forget that there are many countries where they don't really want us sweeping in and remaking them, but also they don't want us to stay out. They want us to be involved in an intelligent and persistent way. And I think that was Holbrooke at his best, and we shouldn't forget that while we are now going through this period of extreme withdrawal, there are many places in the world that want us back. And if Holbrooke were alive, he would be saying we should be back.
And that's one of the great reasons to read this book, which is it's not only a work of history, but it's a guidebook to what America can be. Thank you so much, George.
Thank you, Walter.